Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everybody, and welcome to the second week of the IPI Virtual World Congress, where we are rethinking, reimagining journalism in this time of crisis. We are looking at what the challenges are, what are the new challenges, but also what are the opportunities offered by this period. In this conversation, we have two amazing speakers who will talk about international news providers on the front lines of press freedom. Stephen Adler, editor-in-chief of Reuters, which is the world's largest news. Stephen oversees all editorial functions. Under his leadership, Reuters has received scores of top journalism awards, including 7 Pulitzer Prizes, while reaching billions of people daily with trusted video, text, pictures, and graphics. And John Micklethwait is editor-in-chief of Bloomberg. John, at Bloomberg, he oversees the editorial content across all Bloomberg platforms, including its news, newsletters, magazines, opinion, television, radio, and digital portals, as well as its research services, including Bloomberg Intelligence. John and Stephen will talk about the specific press freedom challenges that the organization has been facing in this moment, but also will look at challenges and opportunities that are emerging from this crisis. On to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. You know, John and I compete very intensely against each other, but we're also friends and respect each other and like each other. And say I wish that political leaders would sort of take that tack, but you know, we go at each other hard in the field every day, but we have a civil relationship, which I hope will turn up in this conversation.
We're like elderly soccer managers, basically.
Yes, right.
Beating.
We were talking about wanting to kind of start by just talking about how the pandemic has changed the environment for press freedom and how we can operate it around the world, and both in developing countries and in more developed countries. And so I'll shoot it to you, John. You know, what has the pandemic done in terms of your ability to do the job as well as you want to?
I think the pandemic's had a big effect on our ability to do the job, in the sense of it limits where you can send journalists at different times. It's done that. I think it's also had an effect in terms of how, you know, we work as both our organisations have had to work mainly from home for quite a long period. I'm actually in the office at the moment, trying to claim one-upmanship over you.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah.
Not a civilised background. Although it has to be said, in Britain, they've now ordered us to, the government is now advising us to work from home. I think it's divides into sort of a couple of categories. One is there is a list of regimes around the world who've sort of mildly seized on the pandemic as a reason to be tougher. And it's not just with journalists, I think it's with most forms of sort of freedom. So it's things like elections have been delayed, sometimes suspiciously, sometimes not. And there's been a general sense that they've looked on this as a chance to do things. There's been, within it, there's been another category of places which I think not for reasons anything to do with the pandemic particularly. Things have tightened up. Introduction, we mentioned places like China and Hong Kong, and there are other ones like that. I think in terms of the domestic, the West, yes, it has got a bit harder. And when I think about that, I think again, it's a mixture between some governments looking on this as a chance to slightly restore the balance between press and them, and there are, you know, a number of areas which I know you've been heavily involved in. But also on top of it, I think there's been a general panic by politicians, and this applies both to autocrats and to Democrats, is that they have found the virus incredibly difficult to deal with. And when politicians are dealing in a world which they don't understand, they do tend to be harder to follow. They tend to give fewer interviews because the basic answer to so many questions is, I don't know, or we haven't done a very good job at that. And I think that goes pretty much through the Western world as well. So in general, I think the pandemic has increased things, some things which are already happening, but it's also had an effect on a lot of regimes that seem like, which are democracies, but which have just found this a bit more difficult to deal with.
I mean, the other thing I'd say is, I mean, this is the highest stake journalism in the sense that if you're not accurate, if you're providing inaccurate information, let's say about a treatment or a potential vaccine, or people do a treatment that's actually untested, obviously drinking Clorox is an extreme example, but you know, we have an enormous responsibility to get it right, to be accurate. And we also have an enormous responsibility to hold governments to account, because their behavior can affect the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of lives. And so one of the things we've all found is that many governments aren't telling the truth about the data, about how many people have COVID, how many people are dying from COVID. And that's become one of the key areas of contention between our organizations and governments. We use unofficial sources, whether they're coming from hospitals or doctors or public health officials, to provide numbers that are as accurate as we believe they can be, and they're not the official government numbers. And then the government, essentially, many governments have either passed laws saying it's illegal to publish non-official numbers, or it's part of some sort of broad kind of national security legislation. So we run into a lot of trouble when we publish the correct numbers and that aren't the governmental numbers. So that's one of the big consequences, I think. And as John says, it's given the fact that there's good public health reasons to want accurate information has given governments cover, governments who have often wanted to suppress the press. I mean, there's always a rationale, right? It's anti-terror, it's national security, now it's public health. And I mean, one thing if they're suppressing inaccurate information, but I think they seem to have a higher desire to suppress accurate information. So that's one of the things we face.
I think they're especially nervous, to jump in, I think they're especially nervous about comparisons. And actually, some cases, the comparisons don't, you know, there are questions, just to use a basic one, which is something I've been looking at in another capacity. You look at Britain and America, they have around about 600 deaths per million. China claims a number of 3. And it strikes me on both sides, that's open to journalistic investigation. On the one hand, from the British and American point of view, Britain's above 600, America's just below. It raises quite big questions about how good our governments are, because I think this is, as you said, this has been a test of government. It's shown how good some governments are or how bad they are at dealing it. So on the West side, there is the rather embarrassing thing that some of the great democracies of the world have not done very well. On the other hand, we have China claims a figure of 3. It's quite difficult to prove that right or wrong, although it has to be said, even if they're lying about most of the cases, they're still doing a lot better than others. And it's one of those rare things where you can look at governments and you can make comparisons, even allowing for the fact that the numbers are recorded differently in different places. And again, that doesn't make journalists popular.
Yeah, it's also interesting how the efforts to create a vaccine have become so nationalized and politicized. You would have thought, right, that the world would be working together to find a great vaccine and then to distribute it to everybody. But now you have the Russia vaccines and you have the China vaccines and you have the Oxford vaccine, and you have US vaccines. And it seems like it's almost a race among vaccines, but also as journalists, we have to be as good as we can be at evaluating the quality of information and the quality of work that's coming out of there. Are we looking at peer-reviewed studies or things being leaked by companies in order to move the stock? So there's tremendous due diligence that's required, and it's all happening in real time, and it's very competitive. So I do think that's been one of the great challenges. People get amazing headlines. You get more headlines for, you know, seeming to announce a miracle cure than you do to kind of cautiously and carefully analyzing what's out there. And so kind of, I think both of our organizations want to get that right. We want to operate with integrity, but it's very challenging because there are people trying to manipulate us as well. So that's one, it's not an unusual issue for us trying to be, that people want to manipulate us, but it's particularly fraught right now because there's so much at stake.
Also weird, this is a weird crisis because most of the other ones that we should confess that Steve and I go all the way back to competing back at Business Week and The Economist. So we've managed different soccer teams at different times in our lives. But the stuff, previous big crises like the economic crisis back in 2008, 2009, back then there was at least an attempt of the kind of countries of the world to come together. The governments tried to, US and China cooperated quite closely. At the moment, there is nothing but a war of words. So to some extent, it's got more difficult. You've got the toxic poison of nationalism has gone into this, which makes it again harder to cover. And I think people also it's also very difficult to do, because trying to work out whether this vaccine is exactly better than other ones is much harder. A quite interesting thing for both of us is that Steve points out, suddenly medical data has moved markets at the most amazing amount. And we both face a similar challenge where the news we deliver, we deliver some stuff on the consumer side, but on the pure finance side, the news the exact amount of accuracy we have has a dramatic effect. People will move billions of dollars on the point of a confirmed report that either of us make. And that makes it very difficult. It's on the one hand, you suddenly found people who are extremely tense about these things. On the other hand, it's about things to do with medicine, which most journalists at the moment don't know, or certainly at the beginning of this crisis, didn't know half as much as they do now.
Yeah, and we've had to redeploy a lot of people into the health and medicine area. You have to get it fast, you have to be accurate, but our team is probably 3 times the size or more than it was pre-pandemic, and that's not unusual. If there's a big battle in Iraq, you might put more people onto that battle, but this is a technical area and you want to make sure you've got the expertise. We have very strong leaders who in that area who know the topic really well, and we've needed to bring other people on. One of the interesting things about this story is that, yes, it's a global story, but it's also a local story in every single country, because what people care the most about is what's going on in their country. So as a global news provider, our job is to be on the ground as many places as we can be, almost everywhere. And I think the current crisis shows the virtue of that, because you do have to cover it for a local audience, and then you have to pull it together, connect the dots, and cover it for a global audience. And to John's earlier point about the nationalization of things, we're kind of collateral damage in a battle between countries right now, because particularly the US and China, because as each country retaliates for perceived wrongs by the other country, they're also including the press in that. So, the US excludes some Chinese press, and then the Chinese come and withdraw credentials from US-based news organizations. So that's going back and forth. So that's also adding complexity to covering things in every location on the ground. And if you're doing work that a particular country isn't that happy about because you're giving accurate numbers and they don't want to give accurate numbers, you're also parrying that, and you're facing threats of visa restrictions and removal of credentials. So there's an overlay, of stress that comes into the system, both because of the pandemic and because of how fractured the world is right now.
Do you think, as I think I do, that even before COVID, it was getting tougher for us? If you look around the world, the countries got problems, we've got problems. It's from the point of view of 2 people trying most of the time to carry on, a contest between us and between others to get news across.
Yeah.
It's been, even before the COVID thing, this has been a problem. There's been a mounting level of kind of censorship in different places, which I know is subject to this, but especially in, there's a predictable list of countries who are involved. But we might come back to discuss what's happening in democracies as well. But in terms of the global emerging markets, do you think that they've got tougher?
Yeah, I think it's gotten tougher everywhere. I just think there isn't that much support for press freedom in kind of any part of the world right now, and I think that's been a real problem. The US used to be a bastion for speaking out on press freedom, and sometimes including it in their foreign policy activities, and sometimes making it a condition of various kinds of deals and treaties. And the US primarily is not doing that now. I think other Western countries are not advocating as strongly for press freedom around the world, which gives more license to countries to use things like the Official Secrets Act and laws against fake news to come after journalists. And I think they're doing it with more impunity. One reason I think they've been doing it for the past 5 to whatever 8 years, is that I do think social media has come in and enabled governments to speak directly to their constituents and to the world. So they need us less, in some sense, to tell their story. So I think they're much quicker to say you're with us or you're against us. If you're with us, we're happy to talk to you and give you access, and that's where you get sort of self-censorship and propaganda-oriented news. But if you're against us, they don't need you, and they're more able to throw you out. And I think that's a phenomenon I've seen even involving non-governmental organizations, even involving terrorist organizations. It used to be if you had a big press on your chest, people left you alone because they wanted you to tell their story, and now they may not want you to tell their story. So that adds a lot more danger, both in emerging countries and frankly in the West as well.
And I think you look around countries, Turkey's one example, you mentioned China, you've got these different countries around the world which they now have alternative ways of reaching the world rather than sadly going through us. And that does change the balance of power. And I think it has contributed towards things. I think social media has also helped some specific regimes in terms of, there used to be a time, that's when we were even younger than we now are, where if we reported something as a fact or something that looked like it's a fact, you would sometimes get a kind of Soviet-style response where some people just simply denied something that was true. Now the new form of fake news tends to be a regime spins 100 different versions of what could have happened. So I think one example from a bit ago was when the Malaysian aircraft was downed. At least part of what seemed to happen then was people went to great lengths to come up with lots and lots of different interpretations of why that could have happened, how it could have happened. And that's the new way in which sort of, I suppose, the war of words and propaganda is fought. But it's not as simple as it used to be, where someone would put forward Pravda and somebody put forward the truth and the two would fight. It's now become, on one side, there's a 50 different explanations, anything to muddy the waters a bit. And I think it is generally, and I think here we can apply it to some democracies too, it's harder to get facts across as well.
Yeah, I think it's also harder to distinguish between what we would call legitimate news organizations and news organizations that either are part of the government or have been captured by the government because the government has brought a friendly owner into that. So, you get some credibility by, claiming to be an independent news organization, but you're not. And I think, we're all kind of grappling with that. What are the sources of the information, and how does the public know whether they're reliable? I think the other thing that's going on that's really dangerous and nefarious, particularly including in Western countries and including in the US, when anti-press statements are consistently being made by the government, the consequences may be in law. There may be anti-press laws, although that hasn't really been true in the US. But the public becomes very anti-press, and not only do they distrust what should be reliable sources and distrust them about things like healthcare and vaccines, but we're finding a lot of hostility on the streets, even covering the fires in California. There are people who think the fires have been set by the far left, and we've had a photographer confronted by a man with a gun, essentially blaming him for being complicit in starting the fires, and we've had staff members shot with rubber bullets, pretty clearly with the police aware who they were shooting. And we've made complaints and tried to get investigations going, and this has happened in several cities. And we've had staffers set upon by people in the demonstrations. And, again, in part because the press has been so vilified that people assume one way or another that we're not acting as honest brokers. So there's a real consequence to making anti-press statements. It frees up more authoritarian regimes around the world to suppress the news, but it also angers the public and undermines trust in the press, and is in some cases very dangerous.
Yeah, I think, looking a bit at domestic Western markets, I think there is a danger. I think America is one example. It's quite interesting that I think Bloomberg and Reuters in different ways have generally been seen, we don't seem to tend to be associated with either party on the whole. And that has helped us, certainly in terms of covering things like the White House and stuff like that. But there is no doubt that on the ground, there is sort of skepticism of the press entirely, perhaps slightly more from a conservative angle than a liberal one. but it's there is also, I think, the level to which conspiracy theories run riot, all the different theories about whether telephone masts were somehow involved in COVID, whether the Chinese were involved in COVID, whether Bill Gates was involved in COVID at different times. The problem about, this is a predictable thing coming from you and me, but the degree to which people can say what they want on social media, and some of it gets through, matters. In general, I'm still relatively optimistic that if you look at what's happened to both our businesses, but also other people's, other people at the kind of quality end of the market, people tend to just put on a lot of subscribers and things during COVID. And I think one reason why was because at least one portion of the population thought, look, enough of this. We need to have the facts, because now suddenly they are a matter of life and death. They became important. So I think that was, it was helpful that you had that as one trend. On the other hand, as you quite very correctly point out, there was another group of people for whom this has been a more maddening thing. And again, do you think in the West before COVID, do you think that there was, I mean, in countries like America, do you think there was more of a problem about press freedom before?
Well, certainly in this administration, there's been a problem because it's been a really contentious relationship between the administration and the press. And I think the press is partly responsible for polarization, because there has been profit to be made in being strongly on one side or another, not where we want to be. I mean, we're not trying to be, he said, she said, but we're just trying to provide the facts and the news in context and not take sides. So I think to the extent the media has exploited the polarization, it hasn't always behaved well. But I mean, I do think we've been in a negative spiral. And I mean, we do have some things we can do. And since this is a press conference, just to talk about that for a moment, I always tell the staff the best way to be perceived as trustworthy is to be trustworthy. So our first responsibility is actually to keep a very high standard and to try to fight through all the noise and do the job right. And when you don't do it right, correct it promptly, but also don't self-censor. I think one issue around the world is that it is so fraught and so dangerous that one news organization after another tries to imagine where the line is and not go over the line. And if the line falls short of fully and factually giving the news to people, that's not a good thing. So your goal, is to be responsible, but not to self-censor, to allow the government to give its side and to use its, to publish its denials, significantly. Really important, at least in our business, to maintain relationships with government leaders. Because much of the ability to function is informal. It's being able to have a conversation and say, look, I'm not for you or against you. I'm just trying to give the news honestly, and I really don't have an agenda. And very often that does, in fact, diffuse the problem. And the other thing I'd say is, there's a view that you always want to scream loudly when something that happens, but just my practical experience in almost 10 years in the job is public pressure sometimes helps and it sometimes hurts. And you don't want to have a knee-jerk reaction. You want to say, how am I going to protect my journalists? How am I going to keep them safe? And how am I going to be able to keep working in that country? And sometimes it's quiet diplomacy where you have a conversation and you diffuse the tension as you would do in any dispute. And sometimes you have to go public, but it's very practical and situational as to which way works best.
I'm very glad you brought that up. I think that's the very difficult balance we have to strike. It's one where it's easy to pontificate, but I suppose try to stick to 2 or 3 principles. One of them is, we want to report accurately as possible. So the first job is to tell the news. Second thing, you have to remain within the law of what you publish within individual countries, which those two aren't always exactly the same, but they can be there can be conflict between them. And then the third thing is the desire to protect your journalists. Sometimes you will end up with, there are some regimes where the law is so arbitrary that sometimes you could be on the right side of it, and sometimes you're on the wrong side of it. So, but the need to sort of hang on, protect people, and to continue coverage is incredibly important as well. That does make a big difference. But it is that balance between knowing what the facts are, which you can often report to a wider global audience. Sometimes inside countries there are laws, and we have to, as organisations, we have to follow laws in the same ways that others do.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd say on that is often how the laws apply to us are ambiguous, and you don't know for sure until they decide to come down on you. And I would err on the side of publishing and publishing fairly and accurately, and then trying to have a conversation about about the law if you have to have a conversation about the law. But I do think I believe in transparency. I believe that sunshine is the best of disinfectants, and so we do try to maintain that vigorous journalism anywhere in the world, and we grapple with the issues as they come up. Conscious of the time, I don't know if it's time for Q&A, Barbara, or not. And Barbara, you're on mute.
I was saying thank you so much for your comment. It was fascinating. I was following your conversation. But I do have at least two questions. One comes from Emre, and he says news agencies retain the public values as arbiters of truth, something they've been talking about. Their business model, on the other hand, has changed and is changing. How do you evaluate the strengths of your organizations and your competitors amid the ongoing evolutions of news business? So basically looking at transformation, how do you see this in your organizations?
I'll take that one. I think we're both lucky in this respect. I think that both Reuters and Bloomberg, our main source of revenue is made out of our customers paying directly for that news. And that is actually a very important thing, because it means that your main loyalty, whenever we have a question, I always ask myself, if I was someone correctly paying Bloomberg money to get a terminal, what would I think is, have we acted fairly? Did we say something? Did we get it right? So I think we have had an advantage with our current soccer teams in terms of how the game that we're playing, which is one where actually this issue of truth works in our favor. The more objectively we can report, the more valuable we are to the people who want to pay to get us. I think, as Stephen pointed out, that's not true of everybody. That we live in an era of very partisan press, and where different brands have found a lot of value, certainly for the shareholders, in terms of appealing to sort of one bit or the other. And it's sometimes a little easy in many cases, the sort of news is actually quite good in bits of what people report, but it comes from an angle which means the other side automatically distrusts them. And what we're both struggling to do, hopefully succeeding in, is to try and sort of aim towards that independent middle, because we've shown that there's a lot of value there. I think now more than ever, people want to pay for things. So at the moment, I see where the question is coming from, and there are some very obvious brands who are following partisan strategies, and that's good luck to them. But I think both Steve and I are in the middle on that, and we found a path. Steve is now going to tell me that his
I mean,
right.
To the extent people have done surveys of this, at least what the public says they want is the kind of news we produce, and they don't say they want polarized news. There is clickbait, and there's always an opportunity to get clicks on things that you won't necessarily say you like, but you actually use. Our model is similar to Bloomberg's, but we have basically three customer groups, because we have a news agency, so we sell our news to thousands of news organizations around the world. So we're certainly affected by the trends that are happening in the news industry. And some of that is more mobile, people consuming on their smartphones. It's the use of social media, it's the use of platforms. So we're certainly evolving to make sure we're as strong as possible in those forums. Then we have a business that's parallel to John's, which is selling to financial customers. And when we did a deal where what used to be the financial arm of our company spun out and became separate, and it's called Refinitiv, we now have an annual deal to sell news to Refinitiv. So that's a separate one. And then, like John, we have a consumer-facing business, which is really more aimed at prosumers or consumers and professionals. So we're kind of coming at the customers slightly differently in those three ways. But most of our revenue is subscription-based, and that gives us the ability to say over time, what does that customer really want to need, rather than what might be particularly hot today. And so it gives you a longer term relationship with your customer, which I think enables you to do the kind of journalism that we believe in and that we want to do. There are a few consumer facing organizations that have been very successful. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are obviously two, as well as the FT, in charging, very significantly to consumers and making a real business and a successful business out of that. But I am afraid that for most journalism, and particularly local journalism, that the community that uses that journalism doesn't sustain that model. So I think many local journalism organizations have failed and are in tremendous trouble as their traditional print ad base declined, and they haven't found a model. And I don't think anybody has really established what that model is yet, and that's very disturbing.
I agree completely with that. I think the problem is that the local, just looking at America as a sole country, that there's no doubt that you look at all the organizations which Steve has mentioned, you could throw in the Washington Post and other ones as well. They are out there competing. I don't think anyone could really claim that the Trump administration is undercovered or under-investigated. Where it gets more tricky is at the local level. And that is where these big old advertising-based sort of city newspapers in states, got in trouble. Yeah, the only bit I would say, which I'm just saying as a counterbalance to what we said earlier, there is some element whereby I think the media sometimes can look back towards a golden age, which at least for some consumers wasn't there. There's a nice quote from Charles Krauthammer, who was a conservative writer, that he claimed that Rupert Murdoch was a genius because he spotted this tiny slither of the population which nobody else could possibly have seen when he set up Fox News, which is around 35% of the population who identified themselves as conservatives and strangely were not as happy with the fare before Fox News. And so in other words, people, we have to be careful about how we say what is and what it was objective historically.
Thank you for that. Actually, the two recurring topics throughout the sessions of the IPI World Congress so far, there have been very much one on sustainability and business models, which you have been talking about. The others is about also an issue you mentioned before, governments using social media to disseminate what we used to call propaganda, fake news, disinformation, all of that. And I have a question from Damaso asking, can news organizations regain legitimacy by embracing and using social media more aggressively? So can we fight back using social media?
Again, I'll go and then Steve can answer better than me. The answer, yes. I think my genuine belief is, we've both been very honest about the business model of journalism has changed. You look at a lot of this is to do with history. You look back through the history of journalism and you will find whenever a new technology comes in, things go slightly wild. And if you want an example, there was the invention of the steam press, and I apologize to people who know the facts better than me, but it was sometime around sort of 1803 or something like that. And the steam press made it possible to print like 10 times, 20 times as many bits of paper as it was before. And that led to a splurge of the most unbelievably libelous pamphlets and whatever all the way around the world. And a man called Benjamin Day set up, I think, what was the biggest newspaper ever, the New York Sun. She sold for a penny a copy, and it used to come up with things like there were half bat, half humans living on the moon. And when people said, well, that may not be true, he sort of challenged them to disprove it. And then gradually what happened is sort of quality came through. And I think that is probably happening again on the specific issue of social media. It's both, yes, it's a problem, but also it's an enormous source. You look at the different ways in which both Steve's organization and mine can very, very, very rapidly discover whether something has happened, just purely by, we have huge amounts of electronic equipment going through social media, trying to find out things. And many of the most dramatic bits of news are brought to people from that. So I don't think we should necessarily look on social media as a bad thing. The bits where it is bad, history will come back. And at the moment, it's allowing us to cover things quicker than we've probably ever done before.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with that on the news acquiring side. On the trust side, it's very challenging for everybody, I think. And I think one of the issues is the volume of misinformation and disinformation coming over social media is so vast, so many millions and billions of pieces of information that, kind of established media only is kind of providing a small portion. So even when it's trying to either correct the record or just coming forward with more accurate information, there is an overwhelming volume of disinformation out there. So, I mean, I'd say a couple of things. One is there are things we can do. I mean, we participate in the Facebook fact-checking program. We've got 11 staffers who are basically doing nothing but fact-checking, and that affects Facebook's algorithm, and they push down the stories that prove not to be factual, and that is helpful. And we get our stuff posted on a variety of social media. We've got 22 million Twitter followers, and that's an important way to disseminate the information. At the end of the day, you need a media literate customer base or consumer base if you're really going to solve the problem. So I'm a huge advocate of teaching media literacy in the schools, because if the individual has the tools to sort out what's likely to be accurate and what isn't, to trace sources back, then you can do that at scale. You can't really combat disinformation at scale, but you can provide knowledge at scale so people can be better consumers. And so I believe every school system in the world should teach media literacy so that we end up having discerning consumers of news. We'd all be much better off.
Quite an interesting thing. Although I came from the British end of things, I'm sitting in an office in London, where opinion and news have been more intermingled, I think, than the world that Steve came from, where it's more rigidly kept apart. I think one thing which we'd both be slightly scared of is that in democracies at the moment there is a worrying concern about just simply the facts. In the old days, you used to have politicians who would dispute opinions, but the basic sort of facts would not be that much to dispute. Now, it's possibly unfair to pick on Trump, but right from the very beginning, with the issue of the crowds at his inauguration, he simply said they were bigger than other people's when they weren't. And that, rather than that being an issue of fact, it seemed to become one of opinion, rather worryingly. And I think that's the bit where this time there is something different, and it's a worrying thing, and it's not by no means just Trump. He has been one factor in that, I think, and that's something that I think we all find quite difficult to deal with.
I think we have time maybe for one more question, if you agree. I have two in the box here. Maybe I'll present them both, and then you pick and choose. One relates to local news in the US and around the world, and the fact that the pandemic has increased interest in local news. But how can local news providers build on the heightened interest in new audience or revenue opportunities? And the other one relates to press freedom and covering press freedom. News organizations and journalists have increasingly been taking a stand on press freedom issues. Do you see also from organizations like yours, from international news providers, do you feel that, are you giving more attention to press freedom violations to raise awareness also about the type of attacks that you are facing?
Okay, I think we really handled the first question, so maybe we should go to the second one. I'll take this one first, if you don't mind, John.
Yeah.
And then that'll give you the final word.
Always my aim.
So there are, I'm on the boards of a number of press freedom organizations. I think in my role, primarily advocacy should take place in the not-for-profit world, and not specifically that Reuters should be using its news wire and its to specifically advocate for much of anything. I'm chairman of the board of Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. I'm on the board of Committee to Protect Journalists. And so I do that work in that context. I think we should cover newsworthy topics, and press freedom is a newsworthy topic. And I think, the focus on the right to know, the focus on when the press is restricted, what the consequences are for the public as much as for the press, is a valid form of coverage. And when our two Myanmar journalists, Walon and Choso U, were in prison for 511 days in Myanmar under false charges of violating the Official Secrets Act, we certainly covered that vigorously. But I'm not a believer in news organizations like ours becoming advocacy organizations. I think we're news providing organizations, so when it's newsworthy, we cover it. And then, at least for me, I use my not-for-profit activity to advocate more on behalf of the industry rather than on behalf of us specifically.
Well, it's a great surprise. I agree. I agree about 95%. I think there's still probably a role, and it crops up occasionally. And actually, I think Steve's participating in this, so maybe it's not entirely a disagreement. There is a role sometimes, is if you can get all the main media people to say, look, we think it's wrong, you've arrested these two people in Myanmar. But then I think there is a bit of weight on it, but I share completely his nervousness about it. Not least because of the way, and this is just a fact of life, that we are often depicted in this. There's a sort of bit where, and I'll use a total another organization, just as a sort of fictitious example. If two Los Angeles Times people get accused of doing X, if the Los Angeles Times comes out and defends them, then immediately the government who's done it then says that they're just merely defending their own fake news, and so on and so on. And the same would apply to Bloomberg or Reuters as well. So we try as much as possible, just as Steve does, to report on instances of press freedom that are being broken. And I think one relatively encouraging thing is, I think in general, I'm struck that those stories, which you might imagine would not get a large leadership, they do actually. People are genuinely horrified when they think journalists have been locked up, even if a lot of their lives they don't like journalists much. I think that's where it comes in. In general, I sort of agree with that difference between that. There are some very, very good organizations that fight on behalf of our journalists. When I talked about protecting our journalists, and the same would absolutely apply to Steve, we will spend every penny we can to defend people who've been accused of this or accused of that. But doing it through, and I think we've probably both been through experiences of this recently, it helps a lot if it's international organizations attacking governments saying, why are you doing this? Rather than particularly you yourself sounding off about it. You explain why this is wrong, but you don't tend to make a big statement about it. It depends. Basically, you do whatever you think is going to help your journalists most, and it usually is this aspect of bringing in the main sort of multilateral organizations, if you know what I mean.
I mean, to me, it's partly a matter of news judgment. You want to keep your news judgment objective and pristine, and not favor yourself. So when it's relevant, you cover it. Institutionally, I agree with John. You might very well join a group letter or an amicus brief that a not-for-profit organization is doing. So institutionally, you do want to help protect your profession, but you want to take your news file, your news wire, and try to see it as something that's special and distinct, and that you want to just apply consistent news judgment. And then I think you're serving your readers, your customers better.
I would like to thank you both so much for your insights for this conversation, and also for your commitment, dedication to reliable information, reliable news, and thank you for joining this conversation today.